Since Mike Norvell took over as head coach for Florida State, they have steadily gotten better and better. In 2020, they had that huge upset over North Carolina. In 2021, they showed glimpses of building something, and then finally in 2022, they broke out into the team we expected them to be. This past season, in 2023, Mike Norvell showed that he was a legitimate playoff contending type coach as he got Florida State to an undefeated regular season, won the ACC title, and then was left out of the playoff because of Jordan Travis's tragic injury. In any other year from now on, Florida State would make the playoff, and some are wondering if the Seminoles can repeat last year's success. Unfortunately, I don't really know at this point. In today's video, we're going to preview the 2024 Florida State Seminoles, go through their roster, talk about who they added and who they lost, go through their schedule, and the overall storyline surrounding the team. We're going to try to predict how the Seminoles will do this upcoming season, and I will give you my honest evaluation of them. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and preview the 2024 Florida State Seminoles. In order to preview the 2024 Seminoles, we first need to talk about 2023. Last year, they had a significant amount of hype as they brought back six-year quarterback Jordan Travis, they brought back a three-headed monster at running back in Trey Benson, Lawrence Toafili, and Rodney Hill, and then at receiver, they had three guys who were pretty much cheat codes. You had Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, and Jaheim Bell, who each in their own respect were absolutely nuts. Obviously, Coleman became the best receiver on the team, but there was a lot to like about last year's Florida State team. Ultimately, they would be tested very early on, as they'd be set to play in a neutral site game against number 5 LSU. They started out ranked number 8 in the country, and in this game, they dominated LSU from start to finish. They ended up winning 45-24, proving that they were legit. They jumped into the top 4, then would beat Southern Miss, before they had an interesting game in week 3. They go on the road to play against Boston College, and newly found starting quarterback Thomas Castellanos actually almost upset the Seminoles. Florida State only survived by 2 points, and it was somewhat of a scare. Ultimately, Boston College had a good year, but at first this was very concerning. After that, we had what many thought to be the game of the year in the ACC, and that was their road matchup at Clemson. Unfortunately, the Tigers had fallen to being unranked after some early season woes. They went crazy. The game was tied, and ultimately Keon Coleman had a game-winning touchdown in overtime, and Florida State survived. They got through the month of September undefeated, and from there many expected them to cruise to the playoff. After that, they would beat Virginia Tech 39-17, who also ended up being pretty good, and then they would destroy Syracuse 41-3. From there, they'd be matched up with one of the Cinderellas from the 2024 season in the Duke Blue Devils, as they are ranked number 16. Ultimately, Florida State controlled this game as well and won 38-20. After that, they went on the road and dismantled Wake Forest, destroyed Pittsburgh, and then had an absolute test at home. In a game that many expected to be close, they faced off with one of their rivals, Miami, and this game came down to the wire. Ultimately, Miami ended up falling short, and Florida State won 27-20. This was a really exciting game in early November. After that, though, they'd play against North Alabama, and many expected them to run through North Alabama in preparation for the road matchup with Florida. Unfortunately for the entire college football world, and especially Florida State, Jordan Travis would suffer a gruesome injury, and everyone on the team was shell-shocked. The stadium was quiet, and they were actually losing at one point. Luckily, they ended up blowing them out 58-13, but now, backup quarterback Tate Rodemaker was expected to go on the road and beat an SEC rival and lead them to the college football playoff. Ultimately, they beat Florida 24-15 and then would go to the ACC championship game. Rodemaker would not end up playing in that one, so in a really weird circumstance, Brock Glenn would actually have to start against number 14 Louisville. They ended up surviving against the number 14 Cardinals 16-6, but the playoff committee determined that they were not good enough to make it. Honestly, Florida State fans may not want to hear this. I think Alabama made for a more exciting playoff, but Florida State 1,000,000% deserved to be in. Another thing is, people aren't really arguing about it much anymore because Florida State got killed by Georgia, and Alabama almost beat Michigan. Obviously, Florida State had their entire team opt out against Georgia, but at the same time, people kind of stopped talking about it and just kind of said, oh, that's tough for you Florida State fans. Ultimately, after going 13-0, they would get killed 63-3 by Georgia in the Orange Bowl, and this was kind of pathetic, and would end up putting a little bit of a damper on what was a special season. Florida State had a ton of talent, as obviously Jordan Travis had a great year, as he finished with 2,700 passing yards and 20 touchdowns, and also had 7 more scores on the ground. He became one of the best quarterbacks in all of college football, and then Trey Benson led the way on the ground with 900 yards and 14 touchdowns there, and then Lawrence Toafili also had nearly 500 yards and 4 scores on the ground as well. As I said, they had a three-headed monster in the receiving game, as Keon Coleman caught 50 passes for 658 yards and 11 touchdowns, Johnny Wilson caught 41 passes for 617 yards and 2 touchdowns, and tight end Jaheim Bell caught 39 passes for 503 yards and 2 scores. There was a lot of really exciting stuff going on at Florida State, and the defensive side of the ball was even more talented. Jared Verse became one of the best defensive ends in college football, and he ended up going number 19 overall in the draft. Keon Coleman became a second-round pick, defensive tackle Braden Fisk became a second-round pick, and corner Renardo Green also became a second-round pick. Trey Benson went in the third round to the Cardinals, and then they had Jerrion Jones, a corner, go to the Jags in the third round, and then from there they finished it out with Jordan Travis going to the Jets, Johnny Wilson going to the Eagles, Jaheim Bell going to the Patriots, and linebacker Tatum Bethune going to the San Francisco 49ers. The Seminoles had a really successful draft as they had 10 players get drafted. This was insane, but this also leads me to wonder how next year's roster is going to look. Let's now look at that. Let's first take a look at the talent they added, as according to 24/7 Sports, they had the number 11 overall recruiting class, which was headlined by quarterback Luke Krummenhoek, corner Charles Lester III, and corner Jamari Howard. Obviously, there were tons of other blue chip players in this recruiting class, but those were the most highly recruited ones. In terms of the transfer portal, they ended up finishing with the number 7 overall portal class. They grabbed 4-star linebacker from Alabama and Sean Murphy, former Colorado corner Omarion Cooper, 4-star running back Roydell Williams from Bama, 4-star lineman from Bama TJ Ferguson, a 4-star defensive lineman from Oregon, a 4-star defensive lineman from West Virginia, and then a couple of skill players who I'm also really excited for. Obviously, they grabbed DJ Uyunglele from Oregon State, they grabbed the former journeyman wide receiver Malik Benson, a fun gadget running back from Indiana and Jalen Lucas, and then also 4-star wide receiver from LSU, Jalen Brown. This entire transfer portal class is really good, and I think that Florida State's actually able to just plug players in and probably get pretty close to last year's success. Now let's look at the actual depth chart though. In terms of the quarterback position, you will have DJ Uyunglele. At one point, if people would tell you that he'd be starting for Florida State in 2024, they would have called you crazy. He was supposed to play 3 years at Clemson and then be a top 5 pick. It didn't happen. He got run out of town at Clemson, did solid at Oregon State, and is now looking to have a super big year at FSU. He'll be the starter, but I'm not sold he's a guy who can win a national championship. Can he get them to the playoff? Probably, but will he get to the title? I don't think so. I also see him more as a day 2 quarterback than a day 1 quarterback, but again, we'll just have to wait and see. The Noles lost 2 quarterbacks as Tate Rodemaker left and former blue chip AJ Duffy went to San Diego State, so the backup will be Brock Glenn and then the true freshman Luke Krummenhoek. I'm really excited for Luke, and he will probably get a video at some point, but the quarterback position I'm not too worried about as Brock Glenn got his experience last year and should be a solid backup. At the running back position, I'm actually super pumped for the Noles. Lawrence Toafili has been waiting his time, and he should now be the premier back, but luckily they have a couple of other options if he disappoints or gets hurt. Jalen Lucas has started the last 2 years for the Indiana Hoosiers, and while he is extremely undersized, he makes plays, and I actually think he'll get a chance to play a lot this year. You also have Roydell Williams, who spent his time at Bama, so it kind of feels like the last few years for Florida State. They have one really good player, and then 2 other options who will complement him. If those 2 can't work out, they'll have true freshman Cam Davis, who is a blue chip, and the running back room looks like it is going to be solid. Wide receiver, though, is honestly where I'm a little bit worried. It looks like the 3 starters will be Malik Benson, who transferred in from Bama and kind of had an interesting story there. Then you'll have former 5-star recruit Hakeem Williams, who will be a sophomore, and then redshirt senior Ja'Kai Douglas. After that, you'll have backups such as Kentron Poiter, Darion Williamson, and Destin Hill, plus a couple of those transfer players they got. Honestly, I'm a little bit concerned about the position. As compared to last year's receiver room, it is definitely underwhelming. The talent and potential is there, but someone is really going to have to emerge for them. I'm not saying it's all hopeless though. At the tight end spot, they'll return Kyle Morlock, who was one of the best transfer tight ends in the 2023 cycle, and maybe he could end up being the guy for them. They'll also have Jackson West, and then their big-time recruit Landon Thomas. On the offensive line, it should be as follows: Darius Washington at left tackle, TJ Ferguson at left guard, Maurice Smith at center, and Richie Leonard at right guard, alongside Jeremiah Byers at right tackle. Honestly, a lot will need to be sorted out on the offensive line, and Alex Atkins is going to have his work cut out for him. I'm not going to even pretend to be an expert on Florida State or their offensive line, but based on my research, it looks like there's going to be some things that need to be figured out. Overall, I give the offense a B. While they have plenty of talent and potential, I'm worried how it's going to all mesh, and I think September could be a struggle, but by the end of the year, they should be able to find their footing. On the defensive side of the ball, it was kind of difficult to find the depth chart, so I'm just going to try to spotlight some of their better players. At defensive end, they'll have Patrick Payton, who ended up having an extreme breakout season last year, and he should be the main guy on that defensive line. At defensive tackle, you'll have Darrell Jackson and Daniel Lyons, and you'll also have Joshua Farmer. In terms of the linebacker spot, they have to replace both of their starting linebackers from the last 2 years, and I expect Alabama transfer Sean Murphy, Omar Graham Jr., and Blake Nicholson to grapple for that spot. At the other linebacker spots, you'll also have DJ Lundy and Justin Cryer. And at corner, you'll have Fentrell Cypress II, who I think has a ton of potential, Quindarius Jones, Jamari Howard, Azazare Thomas Jr., and Jabril Rawls. I'm excited for all those guys. And then finally, at the nickel spot, you'll have Greedy Vance or Earl Little Jr. At safety, you'll have Shyheim Brown. And at the other safety, you'll have Conrad Hussey. All those guys are extremely exciting, and honestly, I'm just going to admit it, I don't know much about the defense, but it seems like Florida State had a lot of talent to replace from last year's draft, and overall, it seems like there's a lot of moving pieces. This leads me to wonder, how will the Noles do in 2024 in terms of their schedule? Well, let's take a look. At first glance, Florida State has a very interesting schedule. In week 1, they will play in a neutral site game against Georgia Tech, and the Jackets had a breakout season last year. While they ended up only going 6-6 in the regular season, Georgia Tech is bringing back a lot of their talent, and many are expecting them to be near the top of the ACC. While I don't think Georgia Tech wins this game, I think it is going to be close. Ultimately, I think Florida State wins by a touchdown, and this game is much closer than advertised. After that, it kind of feels like a lot of these games are going to be that way. They then come home and play against Boston College at home, and while I don't think Boston College is a national championship caliber team by any means, they do now have Bill O'Brien as a head coach, and I really like Thomas Castellanos, and he caused them fits last year in week 3. I feel the same way as the Georgia Tech game though, and I think Boston College will lose by 2 touchdowns. Florida State advances to 2-0, before they then have somewhat of a trap game against Memphis. For some reason, Memphis is getting a ridiculous amount of hype this year, and some believe they could be the best group of 5 team in college football. Part of that is because of their returning quarterback Seth Hennigan, and part of that is because Ryan Silverfield has just done a good job of building the Tigers program. While I also don't think Memphis is going to win, it could also be closer than advertised. I think they only win by 10 to 14 points, and Florida State advances to 3-0 and looks good but not dominant in any of those games. After that though, I think they start to figure it out as they'll play California at home, and that should be an easy win, and then they'll go on the road to play against SMU. I really honestly have no idea what to make of SMU. They were good last year, they've gotten a lot of good recruits, and Rhett Lashley is proving to be one of the up-and-coming coaches in college football, but it's also hard for me to pick them to win this game. It will be the first true road test for Florida State, and starting off playing essentially 5 Power 5 teams is not easy. Florida State's barely going to survive this one and advance to 5-0. After that, they get to come home and play against Clemson, and honestly, you may get mad at me Florida State fans, but I think Clemson's going to win this game. I think the Tigers and Dabo Swinney have a lot to prove this year, and I think Clemson's going to bounce back and win the ACC. I think the Tigers come in, are motivated, and win by a touchdown or 2. Call me crazy, but that's going to be Florida State's first loss. After that, they go on the road to play against Manny Diaz and Duke, and while Duke will have a fun quarterback in Malik Murphy, they lost way too much from last year's team, and Duke is by no means just stacking talent in the trenches. I think Florida State pretty easily wins that game. After that, they have an interesting 5-game stretch to finish the year, as the first game's on the road against Miami. Last year's game was super close, and it was at FSU, and I think Miami wins. Emory Williams' arm practically came off in last year's game, and this time they have Cameron Ward, who I am legitimately excited about. I know I probably shouldn't buy into the Miami hype, but I think if there's ever a year to somewhat buy into the Miami hype, it is this year, and I also just don't think Florida State is as good as last year, so Miami wins this game and gives Florida State their second loss. After that, they'll play against North Carolina. They return one of the best running backs in the country in Omarion Hampton, but I don't really love Max Johnson, and Mac Brown seems to be on his way out, so I think they win that game pretty easily before a huge matchup with Notre Dame. This game is on the road, and this will be a battle of DJ versus Riley Leonard. I think honestly Marcus Freeman is feeling the heat a little bit too, as the Irish are going to be starving for a college football playoff appearance, and I think Notre Dame's going to get there this year, and part of that road will include a win over Florida State. FSU fans may not be too happy with me, but I think Notre Dame's going to win that game because they are at home, and then for the rest of the year, Florida State will dominate Charleston Southern, and I think they'll beat Florida pretty easily. I'm not really too sold on Graham Mertz or what Billy Napier is doing in Gainesville, and if you do the math, that leads to a 9-3 season. Ultimately, I think they're going to lose 3 games. To me, it's pretty much a lock that they lose to Miami and Notre Dame, but the Clemson game could be 50-50, as well as that SMU or that Georgia Tech matchup. I know plenty of Florida State fans are going to come crawling in the comment section below screaming at me, but part of the reason I pick losses is based on circumstance and not as much overall talent. The SMU game is their first road matchup, and SMU is going to be super fired up to host a top 10 team, and then the Georgia Tech game's in week 0 in Ireland, and you never know what's going to happen, and Florida State also has a ton of new pieces they have to figure out. That's why the Georgia Tech, Clemson, SMU, Miami, and Notre Dame game are the 5 swing games on the roster, and they're going to determine how the season goes. Ultimately, Florida State could end up winning 10 games, but I would predict they go 9-3 and just miss out on a playoff appearance. That's just my thoughts though, and be sure to let me know what you think down below. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? How will Florida State do? And what do you make of this roster? Also, be sure to let me know another team I should cover next. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen, including my Oregon preview. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.